morning. Welcome back to our daily devotion. Happy Tuesday to you. This morning we're in Psalm number 63, if you want to go ahead and find your way there. Psalm 63 represents for us the 13th psalm in a row written by King David in this stretch. But that should come as no surprise. Remember, David wrote 73 of the 150 psalms. And so the odds are pretty good that very often, statistically, every other psalm, you're going to find something from David. But they're not organized quite that way. David's psalms show up all over the place in the book of Psalms, but we are in the midst of a stretch of 15 or 16 in a row that are from David, all expressing confidence in God, all expressing his hope that God is going to rescue him, that God will answer his cry, that God will deliver him from his enemies. And so here we are again, Psalm number 63, when David's now in the wilderness, another encounter. Strangely, or interestingly as the case may be, David doesn't even mention the enemy in this particular psalm until almost very the end, and then you'll notice he does so really for only one real purpose. So let's go ahead and begin to look at the psalm by reading through it verse by verse. Psalm 63, verse 1. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. Because of your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I'll lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips when I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. My soul clings to you. Your right up hand upholds me. But those who seek to destroy my life shall go down into the depths of the earth. They shall be given over to the power of the sword. They shall be a portion for the jackals. But the king shall rejoice in God. All who swear by him will exalt, or shall exalt, for the mouth of liars will be stopped. And so here we are again with David. We don't know the exact particular circumstance of this. Is he on the run? Is he on the lam? Or is he off to battle? But it's clear his circumstances, his environment, the fact that he's in the wilderness, a dry and weary land, informs the imagery of this particular psalm. As he thinks about his loving and longing for God, he compares it to the scenario in which he finds himself there in a land, not quite desert, not quite lush forest land, but in that transitional land where there's a lot of scrub and a lot of dry, worn-out land between the rainfalls. Kind of like many of us spiritually, isn't it? We go from times of great prosperity spiritually to times where things seem stagnant and dry. This psalm should also speak to you if you find yourself in that kind of situation. So let's work our way through the psalm, and let's think about what David has to say to us this week, the third week of January, 2021, as we await in just a few days the inauguration of a new president, as some are worried about what's going to come politically, as others are worried about what's going to happen in terms of riots or protests. We don't know the future, but we do know a God who does know the future, and it's in him we ought to find our hope as well as where we place our trust. So let's read Psalm 63 bit by bit, and let's ask ourselves as we go, what can I learn from this psalm today? What can I do differently in light of God's revealed word for me? Psalm 63, here we go. David begins, of course, with a word of prayer. O God, you are my God, the affirmation of faith and confidence in God. He's the ruler of David's life. But notice what he says about this God. He says, earnestly I seek you. Earnestly, steadfastly, intently. Finding God is not a spiritual accident for most of us. In fact, as sinners, well, of course, the Bible says in Romans, for example, that no one seeks after God. But those who are his people, his saints, his children, they long to be with the Father, but you're not going to find him accidentally. You've got to go looking, seeking him earnestly, David says, with desire. In fact, he says of this desire, he says, first, my soul thirsts for you, a favorite image of David. This idea of thirsting comes from the Old Testament imagery, of course, of spiritual life being compared to water. Ezekiel talks about the water, the river of life that flows from the throne of God. Jesus, of course, offers the woman at the well water that will mean she'll never thirst again. And of course, when we get to the book of Revelation in New Jerusalem, there's water there in the new city as well, the river running through it, the river of life. So shouldn't be surprised when writers use that kind of imagery. But of course, also in a desert, David would have understood what it meant to thirst, to long for something. So he says, my soul thirsts for you. His deepest spiritual desire is thirsting for God, finding satisfaction in him alone. But it's not just a spiritual whim, it's David's entire being. Because notice what he says also in verse 1. My flesh faints for you. It's the spirit and the flesh, the body and the soul. The longing for God, the comfort we find in him, is not just a spiritual Sunday morning only thing, but it's with us every day of the week. It's not just merely some sort of spiritual high that we get from singing our favorite songs, but it's something that impacts our entire being, our soul and our flesh. Thirst for you, faints for you, David says. And then there's that analogy at the end of verse 1 about his own scenario, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Because he's longing for him, he begins verse 2. So, since I long for you, this is what I've done. I've looked upon you in the sanctuary. He's been in the tabernacle. He's been there looking for God and to encounter him in the place that God resides, figuratively, metaphysically speaking, anyway. And he says, or metaphorically, I have longed for you, I've looked for you now in the sanctuary, beholding your power and your glory. Thinking about who God is, he recognizes what God is like, power and glory. Because of your steadfast love, it's better than life, he says. This covenant connection. That's what's going to go with us, not only through this lifetime, but into eternity. So often we spend all of our time praying for temporal, physical needs right now. And David reminds us that we need to remember to be focused on spiritual things, because those are the things that will survive this life. He's longing for God, but he's also looking for, depending upon God's love as expressed in the covenant, to sustain him through this life and forever. It's better than this life. And he says, and because of that, my lips will praise you. So, in light of that, in light of the covenant, in light of God's covenant faithfulness, so, introduces verse 4, so I will bless you as long as I live. God's worthy of our praise. He deserves it. In your name, I will lift up my hands. And so imagery related to worshiping God for who he is and what he's doing, what he's promised. Now back to the language of satisfaction. My soul will be satisfied, as though with fat and rich food. My mouth will praise you with joyful lips. When I remember you on my bed, I'll meditate on you in the watches of the night when we ought to be the most fearful. In the middle of the darkest of nights, he's thinking about God and he's praising him. Why? Verse 7, because you've been my help. Past experiences, past confidence of what God has done sustain us and ongoing. We read about it in our own diary, if you journal, but we also read about it in Scripture when we see what God has done previously for others, knowing, believing that he can do the same thing for us. And so it gives us hope. It sustains us through the dark nights of the soul. In fact, David goes on to finish verse 7 by saying, it's in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. Now, we said this a couple videos ago. The wings here could be the imagery of a mother hen who puts out her wings to protect her children, but it could also be a reference to the Ark of the Covenant with the angels on top, whose wings stretch out over the ark and represent there God's presence. It contains the commandments, the staff of Moses, the jar of manna. Could be that in the shadow of those wings, in God's presence in the temple or the tabernacle, that's where he's going to sing for joy. But notice the recurring theme here. It's not the location, it's not our scenario, it's the worship of God and our desire for it. Remember, he says, my thirst for you, I faint for you. Now he's talked about the fact that he's going to come back and he's going to find a satisfaction in him like rich food. Now in verse 8, my soul clings to you, hangs on, holds on tight. Because your right hand, he continues, upholds me. We know that God holds us, God sustains us, God protects us. And so we return to God over and over for continued help. Now, finally, in verses 9 and 10, come the enemy, the ones that are tormenting David under whatever scenario this is. But those who seek to destroy my life, those who are against the person of God, they shall go down into the depths of the earth. This is not a language about going down into hell. That imagery of hell being in the center of the earth, of course, is false, right? It's come up over time, through the literature. It's because of this language of death speaks of into the earth. When you die, you go down into the earth. You go down into the tomb. You go down into the cave they're burying you. They go down into the grave. They will go down into the depths of the earth. The enemy will die. David's got this imagery of he's going to live because of his confidence and faith in God and the covenant. The enemy will die. They shall be given over to the power of the sword. They're going to die in combat. And thus they shall be a portion for jackals. They're not even going to live long enough to see the end. They're not only going to have a great, glorious death where they're going to be build this glorious, noble tomb. They're going to die in the field, and the animals are going to come and eat them. But the king, David, he shall rejoice in God. I'm going to live. I will be ultimately victorious. I'm going to rejoice, to have joy again in God. And all who swear by him shall also exalt. For the mouths of the liars will be stopped. At the end of the day, God will be victorious. His people will shout his praises. They'll sing his name out loud as they can. They'll announce to anybody who'll listen how great their God is, because God will remember us in the covenant. He'll be steadfast to the end. As our faith wavers, God's never does. May we remember this week as we face the uncertainty of what is yet to be in 2021. May we remember that God is still on his throne, that he will sustain us, that he will hold us. And as a result, we will one day praise his name for all of eternity. But remember, we can begin to do that even now. May God's praises be on your lips, and may your faith make a difference every day in your life.